pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, Ken, here it is.
Thank you, Mr. Willis. I'm pleased to be here this morning. Been looking forward to it for a while. You're in Tennessee, which is one of the greatest states I know of, and I have people who live here in Tennessee. My sister-in-law lives in Nashville. A lot of my folks grew up and live in the area around here in Tennessee. But a little bit about what I do. I've got a little small publishing company that tries to help first-time authors to get their books in print, and we've been doing this for the last 15 or 20 years. We've published probably close to 100 books now. I have 53 authors that we publish right now, and keeps me pretty busy. We have the dry spells when things are not going too good, and then we have the good spells when we get overworked and so forth. But in the meantime, I try to do a little history writing myself, and I started out with a book about a family that came across the Blue Ridge Mountains in the early 1700s. This was one of the first families into what we call now Southwest Virginia. And actually, the first book I wrote, or was going to write, was going to be about his grandson, who was a famous resident of Bristol. His grandson was none other than Colonel John Singleton Mosby from Bristol, the lawyer who fought in the Civil War and became known as the Gray Ghost. Only man in the South that did not surrender. I understand that when he found out the war was over, they laid their weapons down and marched home. And another funny thing that happened to John Singleton Mosby after the war was over and Grant became president a few years later, Grant respected him so much that Mosby became Grant's Secretary of Interior, which was almost unheard of at that time. But anyway, I wrote a book about the battle at Kings Mountain. Did my own research. I've read probably 15 or 20 accounts of that battle. And in each one of those accounts, I found things that did not quite seem right. So when I started to write the book, I said, well, I'm going to write this book from scratch, do my own research, go back to the very beginning and find out what some of these historians missed in their writing. Found out a lot of things that are not in most history books. For instance, and this was a killer for me because I couldn't believe that it happened. Every history book that I wrote, that I read about the battle at Kings Mountain, said there were 28 men killed, 28 patriots killed at the battle. Well, that number has been published in most books, even on the History Channel. They did a special on the battle at Kings Mountain a couple of years ago, and they repeated the number 28 men killed at the battle. I just could not think of what was going on there with the bullets flying as fast and as furious as they were in the beginning of the battle. that only 28 patriots were killed. So I started doing some research. I got people from all over the area here to send me information about their grandparents that fought at the Battle of Kings Mountain. I had a stack of information from families who claimed that their grandfather died at the Battle at Kings Mountain. Well, that was my starting point, and from there I went to the War Department in Washington, D.C., went into their archives, found the Revolutionary War information on all of the battles that took place during the Revolutionary War, found the battle at Kings Mountain, and there were not 28 men killed at the battle at Kings Mountain. There were 45 men killed. So all of these years, 236 years now, 17 men who died at Kings Mountain did not get credit for dying for their country. And I thought that was a travesty that historians came up with the 28, and I know how they did it. In the evening after the battle, it was getting close to dark. The battle lasted 1 hour, started about 4 in the afternoon. By 5 o'clock, the battle was over. Colonel Campbell, who was the officer in charge of the Americans, told his aide to go around and make a body count. Well, he did. He left and made a. If you've ever been to Kings Mountain, you know that it's not a mountain. It's just a series of little small hills and spread out over a pretty good area. What happened was when the aide went to make the body count, he took another troop with him. They walked around all over the area trying to discern between the Tory bodies, the British bodies, and the American bodies. And as darkness started to fall on the area, they thought they had covered the entire area. They came back with Campbell, and he pulled out his little notebook and wrote down 28 men killed. That notebook was kept by Campbell after the battle and served at that point as the official body count from the Battle of Kings Mountain. But afterwards, the government made the American officers in charge made another official count before they buried the bodies. And in that count, they found that there were 45 men killed instead of the 28. And I thought that, that was certainly not a good thing to overlook, with 17 men dying for their country and not being able to be credited for it. And so the families really kind of appreciated the fact that they got credit for their loved ones fallen at the Battle of Kings Mountain. I was down at Kings Mountain last month. I spoke at the museum down there, and one lady in the crowd approached me after I finished my little talk, and she said, you're the first person who has ever recognized my grandfather as fallen at the Battle of Kings Mountain. She said our family all knew it, and we had records to show it, but he was never given credit for dying at the Battle of Kings Mountain until you put his name in this book. And I said, it just really made me feel good that someone in the crowd had a grandfather who had not been given credit for dying there. In the research that I did on this book, I found a lot of things that the history books fail to even mention. For instance, there were 2 women in Colonel Ferguson's camp on the day of the battle. One of the women was called Virginia Sow, and it just said that she was killed. Every book that I read said that she died at the Battle of Kings Mountain, in Ferguson's tent, they said. There was another lady there also. Her name was Virginia Paul, P-O-L. Historians fail to even acknowledge where those women came from or who they were or what they did. And so I did my research on both of those women. The first one was Virginia Paul, who was actually Ferguson's live-in girlfriend. He had picked her up in a pub in Savannah, Georgia, and she had been with him for about 2 months in the field. She just traveled with him. And that was all that I could find out about Virginia Paul. She was a barmaid, and he had just picked her up and took her with him. Virginia Sow was another matter. I did the research on her and found out that, lo and behold, she had been a spy for the British Army for 4 years. She had traveled the circuit throughout the north and south also, and she was something else to behold. She was a tall, red-headed woman, about almost 6 feet tall. She would dress up in her real fine gowns and go to these balls on the American side and infiltrate with the American officers, pick their brain, find out what was going on, report right back to the British. She had been doing that for 4 years. At the time of the Battle at Kings Mountain, there was a spy organization that operated out of Abingdon, Virginia. Abingdon was just a small little place, but it was one of the far western outposts where there was information to be gotten from the north, and I say the south because at the time Cornwallis already had invaded South Carolina, Georgia, and most of North Carolina, and was in control of all of that territory south of us. And he was on his way to invade eastern Tennessee and southwestern part of Virginia. She was very important in the fact that she had all the information about the gathering at Sycamore Shoals. She had worked with that spy organization to find out who was in charge of all of the troops, who was assembling, the names of the colonels who were in charge of their different groups. And so when she left Abingdon the day before, 2 days before the Battle at Kings Mountain, she arrived at Gilberttown, which was Ferguson's headquarters, a day before the battle, with all the information that Ferguson needed to defend himself. As soon as he got the news of this 1,300 men were heading south to meet him at and do battle with him, he pulls his troops out of Gilberttown. Incidentally, he had his headquarters there in Gilberttown, which was a big 2-story home, which he had kicked the owners out of and claimed as his 2-story headquarters. He pulled his troops out and they went south to the high ground at Kings Mountain. He said, on this spot, he said, they will have a hard time getting me off of here because neither God nor money can move me off of this mountain. And he was right in that respect because he's still there. So But he chose the high ground. But what he failed to realize was that these old boys up here in the mountains made their living with a gun, most of them. They either had a flintlock rifle or a pistol or a shotgun, and their very living depended on whether they could shoot a rifle or not. And so when the battle took place at Kings Mountain, these old boys were sharpshooters, and the Ferguson's troops did not stand a chance against the long rifles that we had here. Now, there were a couple of things that would have changed the tide of war, or changed the battle in Ferguson's favor, had he had his rifle with him and had it furnished to all of his troops. He was the inventor of what was known as the Ferguson rifle. It was a breech-loading rifle that saved a lot of time in trying to load. Didn't have to use the ramrod or anything. The breech unscrewed like this, dropped down. You put your bullet in, you put your powder in, you put your primer in, and it's ready to fire a lot faster. Had he had those rifles in his possession at the time, he probably would have maybe won the battle, but thankfully he didn't have it. The rifles were being tested in England at the time, and he didn't have access to them here. They went on, the rifle was accepted by the British, and they used it after his death. But a lot of other things I found out about that were not in history books. For instance, Colonel Ferguson, when he came into battle, he wore what we call an overcoat. It was a long coat that came down below his uniform. For instance, if you go down here at the museum at Sycamore Shoals, you'll see the picture of him painted with the coat on. But the picture is wrong. It shows him in a coat with yellow and blue square checks all over his coat. That coat, I did the research on it. It came in through Savannah also. That coat was handmade by an invalid aunt of his in Scotland, and she sent it to him. It found him in the field about 2 months before he died, and when he would go into a skirmish or a battle, he wore that like a uniform. It was not a yellow and blue checked coat, but it was a coat of his Scottish tartans. His Scottish, what the Scottish were known by was their tartans, and so it was a tartan coat, and historians fail to recognize that. A lot of other things have been written about the Kings Mountain, and one thing that I wrote in the back of the book as a note depicts how I figured the man was killed. In the book, we always try to find out who killed Colonel Ferguson. When the battle was over, there were 7 men who claimed to have fired the shot that killed Colonel Ferguson. And some of them were from Virginia, one from North Carolina, and one from Tennessee, 2 from Tennessee. In fact, one of them has a monument out here somewhere in Tennessee, and I can't remember exactly where it is. It might be down near Boone's Creek, claiming that he fired the shot that killed Ferguson. Well, let me read you what I wrote about the man that killed Ferguson. The big question about who killed Major Patrick Ferguson is still a mystery. Many have the distinction of firing the fatal shot that ended the life of one of Britain's favorite sons, but none have definite proof other than the dependability of their own flintlocks and their confidence in using them. If they said their shot hit the Major, we have to take their word for it. We'll not argue with a long hunter or a mountain man whose very life depended on how to survive on the frontier with their Pennsylvania or Kentucky long rifle. Among those who claim to have fired the fatal shot are Robert Young, Ben Greer, Jonathan Woods, John Rogers, Daniel Whitener, and John Cusick. Major Ferguson was found to have had at least 7 bullets in his body. Since this is confirmed, we have to conclude that the men who claim to have fired the fatal shot did hit their intended target. So I don't think one man can really claim the right to have killed Ferguson, since there were 7 bullets found in him. And that's another thing. After the battle was over, and when Ferguson was killed, it almost drove the Patriots into a frenzy. And you can imagine these old mountain men, I mean, grizzled as they were, some of them with beards and rough-looking guys. They found Ferguson's body. Immediately, they disrobed him. They took all of his uniform off. They threw it in a pile and burned it. And here he is laying there nude. And then for some instance, the men just unzipped their pants and urinated all over his body. And that was a travesty, but the reason they did it was for the proclamation that Ferguson had put out about a month earlier, saying that the men were dogs and their women would leave them and so forth. That made the men so mad that they had, Ferguson had mentioned that particular action in his proclamation. And so they unbuttoned and did what they did. Colonel Campbell saw what was going on, and he came over and told them to cease, quit doing this. He said, "This man has given his life. He fought bravely, and we will not desecrate his body any more than it is." Well, Major Ferguson's aide came up to Campbell at that time, and he was still alive. He claimed the body of Ferguson. And that night, as the battle was ended, the men had butchered a beef, and they had, gathered around campfires and were eating their beef. And Colonel Campbell told the Puster to go see those men to see if they could get the use of the cowhide that they had, skinned the beef out. He took that beef hide and rolled Ferguson's nude body up in it and sewed it up with rawhide. And that's what Ferguson was buried in, was in the cowhide that the men had eaten the beef that night. When they got ready to bury Ferguson, down on the side of the hill, if you've been there, you can see where his grave is. they put, they dug the grave, and the Puster was in charge of digging his commanding officer's grave. When they got it dug, they were getting ready to put Ferguson's body in the grave. The guy in the book, Mosby, came down carrying the body of Virginia Sow. And when he got down beside the grave, he said, dig it a little wider. And so the men backed up and started digging a wider grave. They placed Virginia Sow, the spy, in the same grave as Ferguson. And although it was rumored that he had done that, there was no proof until last year in my trip to Kings Mountain last month. The lady at Kings Mountain who's in charge of the museum there, she said, yes, we did a ground survey over ground penetrating radar over his grave, and there's 2 bodies in the grave. So that pretty much wraps it up that she was buried in the same grave that Colonel Ferguson was. Incidentally, he was promoted to colonel posthumously because he was one of Britain's favorite men. After his death, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel, and that was, I guess that's what he was known as, Colonel Ferguson from then on. But there were a lot of things that I had the fun of doing when I wrote the story. The story is about the Mosby family, what happened to them before the war, what happened during the war, and what happened right after the battle at Kings Mountain. Mosby had been a British scout for the past 20 or 25 years. He had worked as a scout out of Fort Pitt up on the Ohio River, and he had helped bring about many Indian treaties and different things, working for the British government. Knew Washington. He had met a lot of famous people, but he had retired. He'd come home to farm. He wanted to remain neutral, but the British were so adamant about trying to get him to come to work for them that they did some devious things, and that's what I wrote about in the book. They would do terrible things to make people come to work for them. They even hold people hostage, and even threaten them with their lives if they didn't come to work for them. And that's one of the things that got me when I was writing about the Mosby family and found out what happened to him, and that he was in charge of a group of scouts during the battle at Kings Mountain. Colonel Campbell had asked him to train up a group of men as scouts to help lead them from Sycamore Shoals across the Blue Ridge into British territory in North Carolina. And so he did that, and he was responsible partway for the success of the battle at Kings Mountain. Any questions anybody would like to have?
I heard it said that the only British troop killed at the battle was Colonel Ferguson.
The only?
The rest of them were Tories.
There were, in fact, most Tories. Ferguson had an elite group with him. He had 100 of the best soldiers in the British Army. They were Rangers. And he put them on the perimeter, the line, at the Battle of Kings Mountain. They were his first line of defense. 100 British Rangers were the first ones to fire on the American troops. And they were wiped out within seconds after the first few minutes of the Battle of Kings Mountain. So there were a lot of Tories. Most of them were volunteer soldiers that fought as Tories and loyalists on the Ferguson side. But there were also some British soldiers involved in the battle. Sad, but they gave their lives for nothing. I mean, they were wiped out pretty quickly. Anyone else have anything they'd like to ask me?
How did the spy die?
Virginia Sal, oh, that's another thing. Let me tell you a little bit about Virginia Sal. Virginia Sal was from Richmond, Virginia. Her name was Sally Featherstone. And she had been in that position for several years as passing information to the British. When she dressed up to go, like I said, to infiltrate these balls and go into get information, she was a beautiful woman, tall, elegant, long, red hair. When she went into the field, she dressed in a men's buckskin outfit, looked just like a man. She would dress up in buckskins. She had two little pearl-handled flintlock pistols that she wore on each side, and they with the butt forward on them. She wore a hat like a man. She put her hair up in the hat, and when she was in the field, you couldn't tell her from a man. And so she was able to travel where troops were and also get information too. She had followed Ferguson after he left his headquarters there in Gilberttown, and she was in his tent when the battle started, she and Virginia Paul. Well, when the battle was going at its greatest, and the lead was flying thick here and there, one of the British troop had taken a bullet outside the tent. He was calling for help. He had been wounded. And she left the tent to go out to pull him to safety, she thought. That's where she was killed, as she tried to give aid to this British soldier. But other than that, I don't know anymore. I want to write a book on Virginia Sal, but haven't. I did meet some of her friends in Richmond. I know that her family still lives in the Richmond area. Her descendants, family members. If there's no other questions, I'm gonna read you a little poem. There we got a couple more.
What happened to Paul?
What happened to Polly?
Paul.
Virginia Paul? The other lady?
Yes.
After the battle was over, she was not struck anywhere. She was in good shape. Campbell didn't know what to do with her. She was the only woman in the whole muster of people. He sent her back to Cornwallis's headquarters in Charlotte, and he got a couple of men to transport her back close to the enemy lines, and they told her to go on back. I had to cross a river to get back to Charlotte, but they got her back to enemy lines, and we don't know what happened after that to Virginia Paul.
What was the count? How many soldiers were on the opposing side?
It was about even when the battle started. Most people said that there were 1,100 patriots, which was not really true, because there were some who marched and were not there at the time of the actual battle. They were almost back toward Cowpens. They mustered there at Cowpens, and Campbell said, we're going to take all of the mounted men, the ones that had horses. And there were 900 of those men. And those were the men that did the actual fighting until the others came up later. There were anywhere from 900 to 1,100 Americans. Ferguson had right at 1,300 troops. And I think most of them were killed, but about 300, which they took captive. And we're going to march them back to Quakers Meadows, which was up in North Carolina. They were all Tories, or Loyalists, as they called themselves. On the way back from the battle to Quakers Meadows the next 2 days, most of them slipped off into the woods. The troops would turn their heads and let them slip off. They let them get away. They were countrymen, you know. I mean, they had been raised here in America. And however, when they did get to Quakers Meadows, several who were in charge of the Tories were put on trial, and I think only one out of, they were going to hang 13 men, only one was hung for his misdeeds. The rest were let go. However, most of them fled the country. They didn't want to remain anywhere where they were known. They went up north and infiltrated some of the northern towns and became citizens again. But that was a bad time for a lot of the North Carolina people. If they were loyalists or Tories, they left the country. They didn't want to be part of the British Empire, I guess. The British, without the Battle of Kings Mountain, the British would have taken North Carolina completely, and East Tennessee, what settlements were in East Tennessee, and Southwest Virginia, and probably would have gone on into Kentucky. But the battle at Kings Mountain actually, according to Thomas Jefferson, actually turned the tide of the war. And 2 months later, after several more battles, Cornwallis was run out of North Carolina, eventually to fall at Yorktown when he had to surrender his troops the following spring. So. But that's pretty much about the book.
Was there a difference in the weapons used by the British and the weapons used by the Patriots?
Yeah, in a way there was. The British used the old Brown Bess, which was a smoothbore rifle. It wasn't a rifle, it was a smoothbore cannon, musket. Not very accurate at all. And of course we had the American side using the Kentucky and Pennsylvania long rifles, plus some they had handmade. There were rifle makers all around, you know. They used the rifling and to make them more accurate. So, but that actually helped win the battle too.
Did all those long rifles have
Bores,
rifles?
yeah, they have rifles in them.
So they were very accurate.
Very accurate, yeah.
And the muskets were accurate, what,
About 200 yards, 200 yards.
200 yards?
Yeah, about that, yeah.
I can't imagine.
Yeah.
200 yards?
Yeah, they could shoot about 200 yards.
Can't even see 200.
Was there accuracy? Were they still accurate at 200 yards or?
No. They could throw a 58 caliber, no, a 75 caliber ball, 200 yards.
Could you give us a brief critique of Mel Brooks' movie, The Patriot?
Yeah, I like the movie.
Historically.
Historically, what was really accurate in that book was the costumes and the scenery, the place where it was taken, and mostly in the swamps. The enemy in that movie was based on a real British officer. His name was Tarleton. And he was actually Ferguson's next in command, boss. But that's who was depicted in that book. I mean, in that movie was Tarleton. Yeah, it was a good movie, pretty much accurate, especially the weapons and the way they fell back to the British.
I was at Kings Mountain and their little presentation, they were talking about maybe some other battles or something that happened before, and the British had mutilated, or Tories, whatever, mutilated some Patriot bodies. Where was this at? I mean, this was
that had happened 2 weeks, about 2 weeks before the battle at Kings Mountain.
Okay.
Tarleton.
Yeah, that's what it had something to do with that, right?
Yeah.
The Tarleton guy.
They had defeated the American forces, and I think it was near Cowpens, and they lined them up against the wall and fired on them and killed every one of them. There were about 30 or 40 troops that were captured, and they killed them all.
But didn't they mutilate some of the bodies?
Yeah, they cut them. They did everything. Yeah.
I mean, to make it think.
Yeah.
I mean, why would the British are supposed to be
They did that.
civilized?
They
Why
did
they
that to put fear into the settlers and the people on the frontier. When you read the book, if you read this book, you'll find out some of the things they did that would put fear into the countryside. They were far from home and they didn't care, you know.
Yeah, still.
They would do whatever necessary to win a battle.
The Patriots, you think?
Yeah. In fact, it backfired on them when Ferguson put out the proclamation that he would lay waste to the countryside. He would take their women. He would treat them like dogs, you know, and that was. And I put the proclamation in this book verbatim, so you can see why it incites the Patriots. It was a bad time. One good thing I did in my research, I didn't know it at the time, but in researching the men in the battle, in the back of the book, I list every man who fought at the Battle of Kings Mountain, whether he was killed, whether he was wounded, or whether he stayed with the horses. You know, there were several men that stayed with the horses. In my research, I found out that I had 2 great-great-great-grandfathers that fought there. So it meant a lot more to me than it would a lot of other people that read the book. And I didn't even know that until I did the research on the book. So.
This is not on the battle, but you mentioned Cornwallis in North Carolina. I'm afraid my history is a little dim. I think of Cornwallis in North Carolina. I can't remember anything about his pride. Where was he in North Carolina?
His headquarters was in Charlotte, North Carolina. He had come up through the south and had come brought his troops into North Carolina, and expected to be victorious all through this area, but it didn't happen that way, thankfully. Any other questions this morning? A few years ago, let me do this and then we'll quit. A few years ago, I was taking some writing classes, and one of my chores was to write a poem in 1 hour. And I said, goodness sakes, I can't write a poem in an hour. But I did, and I want to read you this. I know there's some sportsmen in here. There's some, especially some trout fishermen. I know we have a good trout fishing area here. It's called the Little Green Grasshopper. From beneath the overhanging hemlock branch on the bank of Big Tumbling Creek, I watched a small green grasshopper leap to a rock in the middle of the swirling deep. I mused at the braveness of the little leaper as he dared to cross the dangerous stream. He rubbed his legs and sang his song as if for courage to cross, it seemed. Lurking below, an old trout spied the little traveler and moved ever so slowly toward his prey, which sat safely on top of the rock in the middle of the broadery spray. Time passed, and the little grasshopper grew bored with his seat on top of the rock. He tested his wings and preened his legs while resting on his perching spot. Spurred by a gentle breeze which blew upon the rock, the hopper leaped his greatest leap and sailed across the water top. The old trout rose to meet his prey, which flew above the water. He took the bait in one swift move and gulped down the little hopper. The old trout knew when I set the hook that he'd never be fooled again by a little green grasshopper with a hook in its rear end.
Ken, thank you very much. We
you're welcome.
appreciate the personal stories and all the research that you've done to bring this history alive to us. So thank you, sir. We
Thank you.
appreciate it. And what a great poet you are, too.